Okay, so thank you, Amy Everitt, for joining me. You are officially the first guest of the Blueprint for California Advocates podcast. Thank you for taking the time. I'm so glad that we were able to connect recently. I think you have a lot to bring to the conversation. If you want to give just a quick introduction of yourself and where you came out of and where you are right now, that would be awesome.
Sure. So thank you, Christina, so much. I am the president of Golden State Opportunity, which is a nonprofit that works to create financial security for low-income workers so they can thrive with the ultimate goal of ending poverty. And prior to this, I spent 17 years as the state director for NARAL Pro-Choice California, along with running the National Corporate Social Engagement Program. And prior to that, it's just really kind of a hodgepodge of electoral politics, both in California and across the country. A brief stint working in Saigon, Vietnam in the mid-90s, and having some exposure to the legislative process before that. So
excellent. So what brought you into the world of advocacy to begin with?
So, my whole family has always been very involved. I mean, my first job was when I was 5 and I was helping pass out flyers for my grandmother, who was running for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors.
That is so cool.
Kind of in our DNA. But for myself, the awakening started in high school when I went to Washington, D.C. on the program Close Up. And I looked around and I just thought, this makes a lot of sense. You could really change the world. I remember sitting in the basement of the Senate building and where the trains are and just watching all the activity that was going on and knowing that we could make change. And then I had an opportunity when I was in college to intern in my assembly member's office. And I had an opportunity to work on, really relevant legislation for today. It was the Oil Spill Prevention and Response Preparedness Bill. It was a mouthful then, it still is. And it's really the toughest oil spill legislation in the whole country.
I'm not from California, so I don't get to have that awesome, we all, went to college together story. But I love stuff like that. And your grandmother, what a phenom. She was ahead of her time.
She was definitely. If only she had won, she would have been really ahead of her time.
That is brilliant. I love it. So when you were at NARAL, I have deep respect for the organization, clearly very accomplished. What would you say are when you started and when you left, the biggest sort of lessons that you walked away from in terms of how to be?
Yeah, I would say there was 4 things that I learned. One was that that information matters. So being able to back up what you want in a policy with a study or a report is really powerful, especially when you're dealing with a controversial topic. And I also learned that people's real lived life experiences are really one of the best sources of finding solutions to the problems that we all face. So an example of that was, Black women in hospitals had really high maternal mortality rate. And it was something nobody was really talking about except in the African-American community. And it got to my colleague, Norbe Flint at Black Women for Wellness, and she came up with a bill, and we became her co-sponsor, and it became a law to do implicit bias training for all perinatal practitioners. But it is that being rooted in what is a real life problem, not something we imagine as a problem, but a real problem. Right. And I think what advocates bring to it is really being able to come up with the solution. When families are grieving, they're not thinking, oh, I know a great policy solution to this.
Right.
When you hear the stories, that's what you really grounded in. So information matters, stories matter.
Let me jump in here. When you say the information matters, can you give me an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, so California is one of the few states that now allows advanced practice clinicians to provide first trimester abortion care. We had a law in the books that said it could only be doctors. And that was just the way it was because the medical community always wanted it that way. But we were able to do a study. I mean, we didn't do the study. UCSF, Planned Parenthood, and others did this multi-year study of what does it mean to train advanced practice clinicians and nurses to perform, and could they do it safely without a doctor? And so we had overwhelming evidence that yes, it was safe. It was sometimes even safer. And so we were able to really rely on that study in order to pass the legislation. But You also need patience because it didn't pass the first year or the second year, but the third year was sort of the magic charm.
So actually, that was my follow-up question. So did you do this study because you were not successful doing the legislation?
No, we were doing the study in order to do the legislation, but we also put out the legislation a few times to find out where we could go with it.
Got it. Got it. Because I know from personal experience that sometimes that becomes the plan B after you know you're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And
you
need
make
to
it plan A.
Yeah. Got it. Got it. So yeah, I mean, it can be infuriating to feel like you need to do it because it may be that studies have been conducted left, right, and up and down. And you're like, I cannot believe that we need to do this again. But from a strategic perspective, you know, patience and keeping your eye on the prize.
Yeah,
So
keeping your eye on the ball, that's really critical. As advocates, it's really, you can really fall into the hole of trying to make everything perfect.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's what you need to do. And sometimes you sacrifice getting it done for the absolute perfect. And in my work now, fighting poverty, you know, there's a lot to do there, and I can talk more about that. But one of the things that I always think about is if I can help 1 million people today, I'm going to help those 1 million people, even if I'm not helping the 20 million people living in poverty. I'll keep working on the 20 million, but let's help 1 million to begin with and keep going. So you really have to pick your strategies. And there's other campaigns I've been involved with, and they're like, no, 20 million or nothing.
I would say that's like the biggest decision sometimes for an organization. Yeah, that's a big deal
to collaborate on. And I'd say my other piece of advice is sometimes you just have to go for it. I have been really lucky both at NARAL and now at Golden State Opportunity, where I did not come up in the women's reproductive health rights and justice movement. I came up in the democratic politics side of things. So when I got to that space, I had a huge learning curve. And the same is true now that I've moved over to the poverty space. But one of the things you do when you change issue areas is you walk into it with eyes wide open. And so a lot of times, you know, I was sort of this thorn probably in the side of the more seasoned and experienced and established advocates, because I'd be like, why aren't we doing this? Why don't we do this? And, you know, there has to be a moment, and there were moments where I said, I don't find your answer satisfactory. I just, that's because it's the way we've always done it. That's not a good answer because you know, we haven't exactly been successful. And so sometimes you have to be willing to call people out and just be like, here's the deal, we're going to do it. Are you with us? Are you against us? Or are you neutral? But sometimes you just have to go for it in order to make the change that needs to be made. And sometimes it ruffles feathers. But if you're not doing that, then if nothing's been changing, what have you got to lose? Like, fail forward if you have to.
Totally. I love it. And I feel like the other side of that coin is don't wait until you think you know everything before you do something, right? Like, you know, that research, right? That women don't apply for jobs unless they're like 99% qualified. Sometimes it's like, I don't know everything, but I'm going to give it my try.
Because you have common sense sometimes on your side, and you don't really need a study to know that common sense is also a really powerful place to be. And then if you can have a study to prove it, great. But yeah, you really have to figure out what the route to success looks like for yourself and what you feel comfortable with. But don't let the perfect be the enemy of getting it done. And don't let consensus be the enemy of it. And at the same time, my third lesson or recommendation is collaboration is critical. So even though you don't have to have consensus with everybody, you know, you need collaboration. One of my colleagues who ran Planned Parenthood for many years, Kathleen Kinnear, said to me, you know, if you want to go far, go with others. If you want to go fast, go alone. And sometimes you have to make that choice. And she and I, you know, we had a lot of respect for each other, and sometimes we closely collaborated, and sometimes we were on the opposite sides. And so I think that's also really important, is that you can keep friends and not be held back by everybody else's constraints. You don't have to make them your own if you're not that you don't have to.
I love it. You're totally right. Wow, I feel like those things you just talked about are pretty, we could write a book on them as it is. So where what would you say right now for anti-poverty advocates in general? Because obviously California is in not a good place when it comes to poverty levels, and it really is a stain on the state. What would you say for advocates in this space is like your biggest legislative challenge?
So we're in a really unique space, literally in this moment, in that, so I am a fifth generation Californian, and I have been involved politically or policy wise for a very long time. And we are usually operating in a sense of that we don't have enough, right? Budget cuts, et cetera.
Right.
And so right now we're flush, and we're getting flusher.
Yes.
That's why we need anti-poverty work, because the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer.
100%.
Yeah. But I would say that for me, the biggest challenge that I have faced is the incredible centrifugal force of the status quo. That the idea of fundamental transformative change just seems to a lot of people beyond their grasp. And to me, right, I'm here with new eyes, and I'm like, hell yeah, we cannot ask the same people who are struggling with a few jobs, who are to go jump through a million hoops, because we don't have the IT systems to make it efficient. That's not acceptable to me. And so, but when I talk to people, they agree with me, but they don't think that there is a solution. So that is one of the biggest legislative challenges. And we have great champions in the legislature. Let me be really clear about that. The legislators are not our challenge. They are great. It is the idea of how do you really go in and fundamentally transform a system that is so embedded and seems like an intransient problem. I don't see it that way, but making other people realize that we could make the change we want, that's the challenge. And then the other biggest challenge is actually at the federal level, because a lot of the changes that I want to make or that I'm recommending or trying to pursue, like around public benefits enrollment, a lot of that is being dictated to us from the federal government. That is where, you know, means testing and those and income levels, that's where all that is getting decided. And we all know that making policy at the federal level is kind of, and the idea of tackling poverty for real. I mean, we're seeing what's happening to Build Back Better. We're seeing, how people are resentful of the fact that we have tax credits and other programs that help, that are proven effective, and they're trying to scale them back, because this is the number one thing that people need to understand around poverty anyway. Poverty is a policy choice. And America has made that choice for a very long time. And so again, that status quo comes back into play. And, at GSO, I say policy is a policy option that America can no longer afford to make. And we're here to take all these tools and put them into play to change that. But it's a long game. This is not a one and done, one bill and we're done. We have to really rebuild. There was a time in America where ending poverty or making sure people who are working hard to make ends meet, there was a time when that was a bipartisan issue. It wasn't even controversial. And now it is. So one of our challenges is de-escalating the idea of fighting poverty as a left or a right or a conservative issue.
Wow, I feel like you are going in a really A direction I completely agree with, and B, like we could really get deep on this. The situation being a policy choice that is so embedded in the systems that we live under, that conceiving of a different way to do a system is impossible, because it's like apple Americana apple pie. What you and I discussed before, which really super motivated and inspired me, is this concept of building political power for people who live in poverty or within that community, and not advocates doing it for them, but in the community of people living in poverty. That to me is like, I've never heard anyone say that before. Let's talk about how that looks like. How do we get there?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense. I arrived, coming from one of the most hyper political issues in America today, the abortion rights movement. And I arrived in the poverty space, and I looked around and I started looking at, what have we been doing to end poverty? Well, policy has not been making the right decisions. And then I looked around, there's no power. We have a lot of good ideas, right? Liberals have a lot of really good ideas, and they're well researched. But if you don't have the power to hold people accountable to changing it, it doesn't matter how good your idea is. And this is a lesson you think we would have learned, but apparently we haven't. So what we're looking at doing is, one, as I mentioned, narrative change. We need to change the way we talk about how people experience poverty so that we can literally find a way that brings people together to work towards, the future that I think most people do want, regardless of how they identify politically. So there's that. And then there is building up the power of not only the people, and I'll talk about that in a second, but also the community. So there is, in this space, you have a lot of direct service providers who are doing the work, day-to-day work in the trenches. You have think tanks and academics who are coming up with like great policy solutions that aren't moving through the legislature, whether it's a state legislature or the federal. And then you have, for folks like in Sacramento and elsewhere who are trying to advocate for the changes that are coming. But what we don't have is literal political power. And I define that both as a political action committee and 501c4s who can play in the political space. So when legislators decide to balance budgets on the backs of poor people, there's actually a power organization saying, not on our watch. If you do that again, which has been the way we have made policy in America, especially budgeting, we have to remind people or show people it's no longer acceptable. There needs to be equitable solutions when times get tough. So we need political power. And then if you think about the number of people who aren't making it, so whether they meet the federal definition of poverty or they're just experiencing rough financial times, those are the folks whose voice we need to capture. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're building up the power and capacity of community-based organizations who work with folks every day. Because I'll give you an example, right? We have a marquee program called the Cali ITC for Me program that helps low-income folks file their taxes so they can get literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax credits back. This includes the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, the young child tax credit. And so we buy data every year, and we buy it and we get about 3 million people in our database. And about 2/3 of them have contact information. And then I noticed that 6.2 low-income Californians claim the earned income tax credit. So where are those other 3.2 million people? Well, they're not in a voter file because that's where we buy our data from. That's the way the data world works. But what if we could work with the community-based organizations who are working with that, give them a platform and a database that we call the people file, where they could put names in so they could also create efficiencies and effective outreach and tracking methodologies for themselves. And as a whole, we're building up the capacity of being able to reach a lot of people very effectively. And step one is not to go to them and say, register to vote and vote for this person, because they're like, I'm working to put food on the table. Right. And that's really my most important issue. So let's be a service oriented. Let's help them get the resources they need so that they can get a financial security or stability. And then we slowly work with them after we become a trusted messenger, or we go through the CBOs who are the trusted messengers to start to, engage them and help them build their power through storytelling, through advocacy, and then through straight up, politics and civic engagement. It is time. This country, it is overdue for a revolution, frankly, from the bottom. There is so much at stake. There is so much distinction between the have and have-nots. And I really want to be clear, this isn't about a zero-sum game for us. It's not about if you take from somebody, you give it to somebody else. There's enough here for everybody as long as we approach everything equitably. Right. And I think there's a lot of folks, philanthropy, et cetera, they're invested a ton in this. But they've been investing a ton for decades and we're not really changing anything. Right. So what we're working for, so we are working right now at that level to help people right now with the system as it exists. But we can't help but notice it's a broken system. Right. So then what we do is we're like, what is the transformative, radical rethinking of the social safety network? And that's what we're building towards. So I think I kind of went off of tools and went a little bit more into how we, our approach to ending poverty, and especially from a advocacy and policy side, but it is build power, build narrative, and engage people all across all systems, because poverty touches everybody.
So The concept of political power, I focus a lot on it in my own advocacy and when I talk to other advocates, because I come out of the labor world. It is something that labor knows to do really well, everything in the realm of political action. And what I find is several things, responding to something you said earlier. So I think, at least from my perspective, and I don't know everyone or everything that's happening at the Capitol by any stretch, there seems to be, yes, there are organizations that do political action with a base of low-income people, usually around an issue or union, for example. Unions represent low-income workers, but immigration, environmental justice, etc. How would GSO approach this from an intersectional lens so that you are uniting with that? And then, so because what I'm hearing you say, which I think is what I've not heard before, is from the perspective of poverty, simply, right? That's the mobilizing. And so I'm just wanting to kind of probe, because we have a lot of groups that do so much righteous work. The other piece that I was going to say is a lot of them aren't funded to do political action. They're set up as C3, or they don't know how because they've not done it before. And it, honestly, if it was me and I didn't know, it looks pretty intimidating to jump into this new world of like elections and candidates and all that kind of stuff. So would love to hear your thoughts on that, and how are you getting, what does your C3, C4 divide look like?
So we are actually just a C3 right now, but we are looking forward to what needs to happen to end poverty, and we will ultimately be a C3, a C4, and have a political action committee. We are not there. So then, and to your point, building power, you build it in a lot of different ways. So that is one way that we're going to explore. But in the meantime, one thing I do know is advocacy and policy making. And so we have grantees at GSO and other partners, and we are actually starting for the first year what we call an advocacy cohort, where we're going to provide training about advocacy, C3, right? Straight up C3 training on what a C3 could do in the advocacy realm around policy making. And so we are trying to build up the folks who are on the ground, who we work with on a daily basis, to demystify that process and to bring them into it. And we did that in the reproductive health, right, and justice space, where it used to be dominated by like 3 or 4 groups: NARAL, Planned Parenthood, NOW, Feminist Majority, ACLU. And we really invested in the reproductive justice organizations. And I don't mean investment just by like money, I mean like time and training. And so NARAL, we had a policy. It was sort of unwritten, but it was understood. We never did a bill without a partner from the reproductive justice community, so that they were learning and we were learning from them. I mean, it is a collaborative, all boats rise situation. And I really think that that is going to also translate over to the anti-poverty space for those smaller nonprofits that don't have a lobbyist or something. We can work with them to build up that power. So we're very, very invested in C3s really going up to the edge of the envelope of what they can do, and then helping them get to that edge of the envelope. And hopefully they'll start making their own C4s and their own. But to your other point about, there are a ton of groups that work in this space. You're absolutely right. We are unique, I think, in that we are very centered in the people, in the communities, and in the policy solutions from a poverty lens. We are like, if you are low income, that's all we care about. You can be a union member, you don't have to be a union member, you can be a gig worker, you can be a self-employed worker, you can be whatever it is. If you are not making enough money to make ends meet in California right now, and in the future in America, you're our people. And we are, our philosophy is we build power through community. And that means, as I said, collaboration. We can't do anything alone. Most people have never even heard of Golden State Opportunity, if I'm being honest. And so, yeah, we want to work with, and we do, we work with the unions, we work with other organizations, but we actually haven't gone to unions and been like, get on board with our policy. We've been like, you have members who could benefit from our programs, let's partner. And then let's talk about how we partner on the policy level. And that has happened. GSO is only 5 years old, and we have been having great partnerships with a variety of unions that represent low-income workers.
I can attest to that.
Yeah, and other groups, so we are, I think the thing that GSO is really looking for is who are great partners for the long term or for the now, but we are open. We're not in the business of being exclusionary. We're in the business of being inclusionary. All boats can rise and we can all work towards that better future together. So there are a lot of groups.
I love this advocacy. What did you say? Cohort?
Yeah.
I love that. How would somebody or an organization potentially seek funding, join the cohort, et cetera?
Right. So right now, we're not a huge organization. So right now, our RFP is by invitation only. But as we grow, we're hoping to expand that. But we have about 40 grantees right now across the state, and we're just hoping to continue to grow that. We also have a partnership program where it's not a formal grant relationship, but it is a partnership. And this is what we have with unions. It's what we have with some companies who have a lot of low income employees, especially gig workers. And we provide them all the materials, right? With the social media posts, the flyers, the information people need to access the programs that we have available through the state and through other organizations. So we have a lot of different ways of being engaged. And this is the first year of the advocacy cohort. So we're gonna see how it goes before we grow it. But I think we're probably gonna end up with about 25 groups in it.
Okay, so if I was an organizer and I do this type of work, but I'm not familiar with GSO, you're not familiar with us, what would you advise at that grassroots level? What should organizations be doing to create visibility for their work and their communities so that they become part of these conversations?
Yeah, that is actually a really tough question. And the reason I say that is that I do a listening tour. Today is literally my 2nd year anniversary of working for GSO, and I've done 2 listening tours where I spend a couple of months just going talking with all of our grantees. They are overwhelmed with the incredible need that is out there, and they lead with their hearts. They are service providers. They are in the trenches. I mean, some are like, we didn't have funding for it, but we were out there doing it anyway.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, no, you're a better resource. Right. And so I'm not in a position to tell an organization like that to do one more thing to raise their profile. It's really my job to go find them and to talk with them and to see if we can create the relationship. Referrals are great. I'm always happy to meet with new people and new organizations, but the work that is happening right now is so overwhelming for so many people that I don't expect there's a lot of people who are able to lift their heads out of the work with an eye to advocacy, even though in everybody I've talked to, they understand why it's so important. And that's why they're joining our cohort. So I don't have a good answer for that. I just think that folks need to keep doing the great work that they're doing, and hopefully we can all work together. I mean, we want to meet. We are always expanding our group.
So being respectful of your time, what is your number 1 tip for anyone who's listening to this, and really the emphasis being on actionable, like they can go do this?
Yeah. I would say figure out what role you want to play and go do it. Like literally, you're either going to want to be, the folks who are way out there on the moral high ground, which is an important place to be and make people come to you, shift, or you're going to be that super pragmatic player who's going to, figure out the incremental change at the time on your trying to get to that moral high ground that we need to operate on. But I say if you want to be an advocate, is find the organization that shares your values, right? Whether it's a pragmatic one or it is we're holding out for everything. Find the organization that reflects your values on the issues that you care most about and join them. Every organization needs people out there signing their petitions, making phone calls, and being engaged. And that's at the grassroots level, and then, go and meet with your legislators, tell them what issues you care about. You don't need permission from anybody to go meet with your representatives, whether they're your school board members, your city council members, your board of supervisors, or your state legislators, go meet with them. Tell them the issues that you care about. Preferably go with a solution, and preferably, if you have the capacity, go with an organization that has a solution that you agree with. That's what I would say, is get involved. now is the time. We have been pandemically dissociated from the policymaking world for a lot of it, but go out there and do it. Like, get those Zoom or the in-person appointment, find the organizations you care about and just start doing it, because now is the time. Now is not the time to be like, oh, we're going back to things and I'm going to get really, really busy with my life again. And remember that at one point I cared about an issue. Just go care about it and make it happen, because now is the time to make it happen, especially in California when nobody can tell you they can't afford it. That's a huge difference, and it's not going to stay around forever. So now is the time to really get involved and get
That's
with
right.
the community.
And the people in power should theoretically agree with you.
Right.